Detective Richards and Officer Thompson carried themselves with the swagger of men who'd never been questioned. Their badges gleamed in the afternoon sun as they approached the small roadside vegetable stand, convinced they'd found another easy mark in the endless war on petty crime. They thought they were dealing with just another aging vendor trying to make ends meet. They barked commands, overturned crates of tomatoes, and forced the elderly man to his knees while curious shoppers watched from the parking lot across the street. They believed he was defenseless. They assumed he was nobody. But they had no idea who they were truly confronting. This corner lot had become Marcus Washington's sanctuary. Not the sterile conference rooms of the federal courthouse where he spent decades as a circuit judge, not the bitter appeals that filled his docket every morning, but this simple patch of earth where he grew vegetables and answered to nothing but the seasons and the soil. The sun cast long shadows across his neat rows of lettuce and peppers. Marcus wiped his brow with a weathered handkerchief, his trained eyes catching movement in the distance. A patrol car approached deliberately, its occupants visible through the windshield. "Afternoon, officers," Marcus offered, straightening behind his wooden counter. His greeting carried the measured courtesy of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating difficult conversations. The taller officer, Richards according to his nameplate, responded with barely concealed disdain. The younger man, Thompson, positioned himself at the edge of the stand as if preparing to spring into action. Something cold settled in Marcus's chest, not fear, but recognition. He'd committed no violations. His permits were current, his scales certified, his produce fresh. Yet here they stood with barely restrained aggression, rifling through his cash box without explanation. Thompson grabbed a basket of apples, dumping them carelessly onto the ground to inspect the container beneath. Finding nothing suspicious, he kicked the scattered fruit aside. Richards moved closer, invading Marcus's space with the blunt confidence of someone certain they couldn't be challenged. "Think you're smart?" Richards snapped. "Set up out here in the middle of nowhere, no witnesses around." "You're making an error," Marcus replied quietly, his voice carrying decades of courtroom authority. A final warning offered more from habit than hope. Richards laughed harshly, shoving Marcus's shoulder with his palm. "Not hard, but enough to establish dominance." "No, old man," he said, "you made the error thinking you could operate without proper oversight." Marcus closed his eyes briefly against the familiar sting of assumption and prejudice. Not the physical contact, but the casual dismissal of his humanity. Thompson's boot ground faultlessly into the soft dirt as he moved toward the small storage shed, searching not for violations but for any excuse to justify the harassment he clearly enjoyed inflicting. The low rumble of approaching vehicles grew louder. A minivan had pulled into the nearby parking lot, the family inside standing at their windows with concerned expressions. A second car slowed, its driver filming with his phone in unwavering focus. Marcus felt the handcuffs bite into his wrists as Richards forced his arms behind his back. The metal was tight, designed more for pain than security. But Marcus had learned many things in his 72 years, including techniques from his military service that most people had forgotten he possessed. "You're violating my constitutional rights," he said, his voice carrying the measured precision of someone who'd spent decades interpreting law. "You have no probable cause for detention, much less for searching my property or seizing my merchandise." Richards's face twisted into an ugly sneer as he stepped closer. "Constitutional rights," he mocked. "Out here, we are the Constitution." Thompson joined in the intimidation, standing uncomfortably close. But Marcus had faced down hostile courtrooms and violent defendants. He understood leverage better than brute force. He shifted his position, drawing a controlled breath, and with a calculated twist of his shoulders combined with precise upward pressure, the handcuffs separated with a sharp crack that was masked by the sound of a car door slamming in the parking lot. For a crucial moment, the officers failed to notice. They were too focused on their performance, too certain of their control. Marcus moved with purpose. In one fluid motion, Marcus grabbed Richards's outstretched wrist and used the man's own momentum against him. Richards's joint screamed in protest as Marcus pivoted low, sweeping the officer's legs with a technique learned decades ago in basic training. Richards hit the ground hard, gasping, but rolled quickly trying to recover. Thompson was already charging, reaching for his baton in a clumsy attempt at escalation. Marcus allowed the grab, using Thompson's forward momentum to redirect him over his hip, sending the younger officer tumbling into a display of watermelons. The confrontation continued with brutal efficiency that spoke of long-dormant but never-forgotten training. The dusty lot swayed gently in the heat, the afternoon sun bearing down mercilessly. The only sounds were labored breathing and the distant hum of traffic from concerned citizens calling for backup. Marcus's vision blurred momentarily from a glancing blow, his 72-year-old body protesting the sudden violence. But he refused to yield. He planted a knee into Thompson's back, pinning him with calculated pressure, while reaching for the dropped radio. "Officer down," he growled into the device, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Situation contained. Requesting immediate supervisor response." Richards struggled to his feet, advancing with clenched fists. Marcus held his ground until the last moment, letting the officer's momentum commit before sidestepping with practiced precision. Richards stumbled past, off balance, and Marcus delivered a precise strike to pressure points that sent the man crumpling into the overturned produce displays. Thompson tried one more charge. Swinging his recovered baton in a wild arc, Marcus caught him mid-swing with a devastating strike to the solar plexus that dropped the younger officer instantly, breathing heavily, blood seeping from a cut above his eye. Marcus straightened slowly against the bright glare of the afternoon sky. He moved methodically, retrieving zip ties from his truck. Ironically, the same restraints the officers had planned to use on him. Multiple patrol cars were approaching rapidly across the parking lot. Marcus picked up the radio again and keyed the transmission. "This is Judge Marcus Washington," he said clearly. "Situation secure. Officers restrained. Standing by." The words hung in the hot air, undeniable and recorded not only over police channels but by dozens of civilian phones still capturing every moment from the growing crowd of witnesses. Marcus stood silent and dignified, battered and bleeding but wholly unbroken, watching as understanding began to dawn among the arriving backup officers. A transformation moved through the response team like electricity. The kind of recognition that couldn't be hidden or controlled. Shoulders straightening, eyes widening behind sunglasses, mouths opening in sudden comprehension of the magnitude of their colleague's mistake, the sergeant nearest him blinked rapidly, his jaw tightening as if absorbing a physical blow. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The afternoon heat seemed to intensify, the only sound the distant murmur of gathering onlookers and the static of multiple radios. Marcus reached slowly into his shirt pocket, withdrawing a leather wallet. He opened it deliberately, revealing his federal judicial credentials alongside his retired military identification. 35 years on the federal bench, he said quietly, his blood-stained hands steady as he displayed the documentation. 27 years before that in the United States Army. "And you're going to remain exactly where you are," he continued, nodding toward the backup team frozen at the perimeter. "Internal Affairs, the FBI, and federal marshals will want every detail of what transpired here today." The sergeant swallowed hard, understanding that he was witnessing the beginning of a scandal that would echo through law enforcement agencies for months to come. Downtown at police headquarters, the atmosphere grew thick with tension as word spread through the building. In separate holding rooms, Richards and Thompson sat under guard, each man nursing his injuries while contemplating the avalanche of consequences bearing down on them. In the lobby, the response team shifted uncomfortably, their weapons holstered, their faces betraying growing awareness that whatever story they might have believed about a routine vendor inspection had crumbled into something far more serious. The department's crisis management specialist, Attorney Helen Morrison, arrived within an hour. She entered Marcus's temporary interview room with practiced calm, her briefcase polished, her smile carefully calibrated. "Judge Washington," she began smoothly, "perhaps we can resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding without unnecessary complications." Marcus studied her with the penetrating gaze of someone who'd evaluated thousands of legal arguments. "Misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice carrying quiet steel. "Your officers assaulted a federal judge. They destroyed property, violated constitutional rights, and did so while being recorded by multiple witnesses. What exactly do you find unclear about that?" Morrison's professional facade flickered. "The department is prepared to offer full compensation for any damages, of course, and we can arrange for additional training. You believe dignity can be purchased like damaged goods at a discount store," Marcus interrupted. "You think accountability is something to be negotiated away behind closed doors." Morrison's smile faltered completely. The courtroom composure she wore like armor was slipping badly. "Judge Washington," she tried again, "surely we can find a mutually beneficial resolution. This isn't about avoiding embarrassment," Marcus continued with the steady momentum of someone who'd weathered far worse storms. "This is about justice. Something your department seems to find inconvenient." Within hours, civil rights organizations and legal advocacy groups had mobilized. Phone calls crisscrossed the state as news of the incident spread through networks of attorneys and activists who understood the broader implications. At the state capitol, Representative Sarah Chin called an emergency press conference. She stood on the marble steps with Marcus beside her, cameras flashing, microphones bristling, as the state's political establishment took notice. "We will not permit law enforcement to hide behind badges while trampling the rights of citizens," she declared, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "We will not allow institutional racism to masquerade as legitimate policing." The FBI's Civil Rights Division assigned Special Agent Maria Santos to lead the investigation. She arrived at police headquarters 2 days after the press conference, a woman of compact build and sharp intelligence, her dark suit immaculate, her expression methodical and unforgiving. Santos demanded complete access to all personnel files, disciplinary records, training documents, and internal communications. She made clear in her first briefing that no one involved would be considered off-limits to her investigation. As Santos dug deeper, the scope of the problem became apparent. This wasn't an isolated incident but part of a disturbing pattern stretching back years. Complaint after complaint had been filed against various officers for harassment, racial profiling, and excessive force during routine stops. Vendors had been harassed without justification. Minority business owners searched aggressively without warrants. Families detained for hours without explanation. Written complaints had been filed, recorded in the system like dying echoes, then buried under layers of bureaucratic delays. Nearly all investigations had been closed without discipline. Review committees had been disbanded, internal audits postponed indefinitely. Each discovery added weight to a growing mountain of evidence so massive that even the most determined cover-up couldn't hide it from coming scrutiny. Santos called a private meeting with the police chief that afternoon, arriving with 3 thick binders and a secure digital drive. Her documentation was methodical, her case airtight, her message clear. Change was inevitable, and no one in the department's leadership could pretend they hadn't seen it coming. Now, back in her makeshift command center, Santos pulled out her secure phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but hoped never to use. It rang once before connecting. "Judge Washington," she said when he answered, "you were right. It's worse than we imagined. Much worse." On the other end of the line, Marcus said nothing for a long moment. But Santos could feel the cold satisfaction in his silence, not vindictive, but the quiet vindication of someone who'd recognized institutional rot long before others were willing to acknowledge it. The state legislative hearings began 3 weeks later. The ornate chamber filled beyond capacity as representatives from civil rights organizations, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens lined the gallery. Protesters gathered outside holding signs reading "Justice for Judge Washington," "End Police Impunity," and "Protect Those Who Serve Justice." Representative Chen opened the proceedings with a statement that would dominate news cycles for weeks. "For too long," she said, standing before the committee with Marcus seated quietly behind her, "those entrusted with public safety have operated with impunity, their misconduct hidden behind institutional walls and professional courtesy." The hearings laid bare a culture of corruption and cover-up that had operated for years without meaningful oversight. Witness after witness testified to similar experiences: business owners harassed, citizens detained without cause, complaints ignored or actively suppressed. Agent Santos took the stand on the final day, her presentation calm, methodical, and devastating. She connected every buried complaint, every ignored violation, every act of retaliation back to deliberate decisions made throughout the department's chain of command. She presented dates, names, internal memos, showing how accountability mechanisms had been dismantled not by accident but by design. Committee members who had entered the hearing skeptical emerged convinced that fundamental reform was not just necessary but urgent. Back at headquarters, panic spread through the department's leadership like wildfire. Senior officers who had once been trusted allies now eyed each other warily, their conversations guarded, their loyalty cracking under pressure. Private meetings devolved into accusations. Fingers pointed in every direction. Files were quietly altered, then leaked to reporters. Yesterday's allies became today's scapegoats in a desperate scramble for survival. In the end, the reckoning was swift and comprehensive. Richards and Thompson faced federal charges for civil rights violations. Department supervisors who had enabled the culture of impunity found themselves stripped of authority and facing their own investigations. The crisis forced changes that rippled throughout law enforcement agencies statewide. New oversight mechanisms, mandatory bias training, civilian review boards, and whistleblower protections transformed departments that had resisted reform for decades. Months later, as autumn painted the countryside in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus returned to his vegetable stand. But now it was more than just a retirement project. It had become a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of institutional oppression. Regular customers stopped not just for fresh produce but for quiet conversations about justice and accountability. Local law students volunteered to help with the harvest, learning lessons about constitutional rights that no classroom could provide. One evening, as the late-season sun cast long shadows across his garden, Marcus sat on his porch overlooking the stand that had become the center of a movement he never intended to start. Representative Chin found him there, as she often did, when the day's political battles seemed too small for the work still ahead. She settled into the chair beside him without ceremony, both of them watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "Any regrets?" she asked quietly. Marcus considered the question, feeling the weight of everything that had followed from that afternoon confrontation. The investigations, the hearings, the fundamental changes in how law enforcement operated throughout the state. "None," he said finally. "Sometimes standing up requires accepting that the ground will shift beneath everyone's feet." The formal recognition ceremony wasn't held behind closed doors or in some forgotten corner of the State House. It was public, deliberate, staged on the Capitol steps under the full attention of the state and nation. Marcus stood toward the back of the gathering, away from the politicians in their pressed suits, away from the reporters jostling for position near the barriers. He wore a simple dark jacket over his best shirt, his weathered hands folded quietly before him, When the speeches ended and the media swarmed forward seeking quotes, several legislators made their way toward him, all eager handshakes and campaign-ready smiles. Judge Washington, one of them, called out, a congressman whose face had become familiar from cable news appearances, "This victory belongs to all of us who believe in justice." Marcus studied the man's extended hand for a moment before accepting it with quiet dignity. "Victory," he repeated. "Two officers assaulted a citizen and faced consequences. That's not victory, that's basic accountability. Victory will be when such accountability becomes so routine that it no longer makes headlines." The congressman's smile flickered, uncertain how to respond to such directness. Marcus nodded politely and made his way through the crowd toward his truck, ready to return to the simple honesty of soil and seasons. 6 months later, the morning mist rose gentle and welcoming from the warm earth of Marcus's expanded garden. The small vegetable stand had grown into a community market, with local farmers contributing produce and families gathering for weekend conversations about everything from crop rotation to constitutional law. Marcus moved among his plants with quiet satisfaction, his weathered hands tending to tomatoes and peppers that would feed neighbors and strangers alike. He wore no robes today, no formal recognition of his judicial status, just work clothes and the deep contentment of someone who had held firm when it mattered most. Customers approached throughout the morning, some drawn by the quality of his produce, others by the stories they'd heard about the man who'd refused to accept injustice even at personal cost. As the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm, Marcus leaned back in his folding chair under the shade of his market tent. He watched families selecting vegetables, listened to children laugh as they discovered how carrots grew underground, and felt the profound peace that comes from knowing you've stood for something larger than yourself. Thought about the long journey that had brought him here, the confrontation, the investigation, the difficult work of forcing institutions to face their own failures. And despite everything, he felt only gratitude for the opportunity to prove that dignity and justice were not negotiable, regardless of who stood in opposition. The afternoon stretched before him, calm and full of possibility, as new customers arrived and old friends stopped to share the quiet wisdom that grows best in soil tended by hands that have never forgotten the true meaning of service.